The champagne glass trembled in my hand as Tyler's face drained of all color. He'd just asked his friend Mark why a federal judge would be at his wedding reception, laughing about how I was just some local lawyer. What he didn't expect was Mark's response. "Dude, Emma Rodriguez is marrying Judge Morrison next spring. Haven't you seen the legal journals? His family's worth $300 million. This is the same man who 2 months earlier had questioned whether I could handle his tax fraud case. The same family who called me worthless at Sunday dinners for 30 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a girl they dismissed as a dreamer became the most powerful person in the room, and how one wedding reception changed everything forever." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and for the first 25 years of my life, I was invisible in my own family. Not literally, of course, but in every way that mattered. I grew up in a modest ranch house in Tempe, Arizona, where the desert heat wasn't the only thing that could make you feel suffocated. My sister Jessica was the sun around which our entire family orbit revolved. 3 years older than me, she possessed everything our parents valued in a daughter. Her honey blonde hair caught light in a way that photographers noticed. Her laugh filled rooms with warmth, and her natural charisma meant she was elected homecoming queen without even campaigning. While I spent my Friday nights at the public, library researching Supreme Court cases, Jessica was at parties, football games, and eventually sorority mixers at Arizona State University. The difference between us became apparent early. When Jessica brought home a B+ on her 4th grade spelling test, Mom hung it on the refrigerator with a shiny star sticker and took her out for ice cream. When I brought home straight A's, Dad would glance at my report card, nod approvingly, and say something like, "Good job, kiddo. But remember, grades aren't everything." Even at 9 years old, I understood the subtext. Jessica's achievements were celebrations. Mine were expectations. Our house told the story of our family's priorities without anyone having to say a word. The living room mantel displayed Jessica's cheerleading trophies like sacred artifacts, each one polished and positioned to catch the afternoon sun streaming through our picture window. Her homecoming queen crown sat in a place of honor on the bookshelf, and her sorority composite hung prominently in the hallway where every visitor would see it. When she graduated with her marketing degree, Mom had the diploma professionally framed and mounted it next to Dad's high school football photo. My academic achievements lived in different spaces. My debate team trophy sat on a shelf in my bedroom where guests wouldn't notice it. The certificate recognizing me as valedictorian of my high school class was tucked into a photo album that rarely left the closet. When I graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State with my bachelor's degree in political science, Mom put the photo in a simple frame and placed it on the bookshelf between a plant and some old magazines, where it blended into the background. The physical arrangement of our family photos reflected our emotional hierarchy perfectly. Jessica's professional senior portraits dominated the piano top, her perfect smile beaming from expensive frames. The few pictures that included me showed a skinny girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, usually positioned slightly behind or to the side of the main family group. Even in our Christmas cards, I somehow ended up partially obscured by someone's shoulder or arm. Dad worked as an insurance agent for State Farm, the kind of job that provided steady income and reliable benefits but never made anyone wealthy. He drove a 10-year-old Toyota Camry and wore the same rotation of polo shirts and khakis to work every day. Mom stayed home until we were both in school, then took a part-time job at the local craft store, more for social interaction than financial necessity. They were good people, hardworking and loving in their own way, but their vision of success was narrow and traditional. In their minds, Jessica represented the perfect daughter, beautiful enough to attract a successful husband, social enough to maintain friendships and networks, and ambitious enough to have her own career until children came along. She followed the script they'd written for her flawlessly. and they rewarded her adherence with constant praise and attention. I represented something they didn't quite understand. Where Jessica was effervescent, I was thoughtful. Where she thrived, in groups, I preferred one-on-one conversations or solitary activities. Where she chose a major that would lead to immediately marketable skills, I gravitated toward subjects that fascinated me intellectually, but seemed impractical to their middle-class sensibilities. The dinner table became the daily stage where these dynamics played out with predictable regularity. Dad would ask Jessica about her job at the advertising agency, her latest client presentation, or her social plans for the weekend. His voice carried genuine interest and pride as she described her professional victories and personal adventures. When the conversation turned to me, his tone shifted subtly but noticeably. He'd ask about my law school classes or my part-time job at the university library, but the questions felt obligatory rather than engaged. Mom's reactions followed similar patterns. She'd listen to Jessica's stories about office politics or dating drama, with the rapt attention of someone watching her favorite television show. When I tried to share something interesting I'd learned in constitutional law or criminal procedure, her eyes would glaze over within minutes. She'd nod politely, and then steer the conversation back to topics she found more relatable, usually Jessica's latest romantic interest or career milestone. The most painful part wasn't the overt favoritism, which might have been easier to confront and address. Instead, it was the subtle but constant message that my interests, my achievements, and my dreams were somehow less valuable than Jessica's. When she talked about her marketing campaigns, our parents treated her like a creative genius. When I discussed legal precedents or Supreme Court decisions, they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language they had no interest in learning. This dynamic created a strange paradox in our household. I consistently outperformed Jessica, academically, scored higher on standardized tests, and received more merit-based recognition from teachers and counselors. Yet our parents worried constantly about my future while assuming Jessica's success was inevitable. They fretted that I was too serious, too studious, too focused on abstract concepts instead of practical concerns. Meanwhile, they never questioned whether Jessica's party-focused lifestyle in college or her entry-level marketing job would translate into long-term security and happiness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony became apparent during family gatherings with extended relatives. Aunts and uncles would compliment my academic achievements and ask about my plans for law school, clearly impressed by my dedication and intelligence. But instead of feeling proud, Mom and Dad seemed almost embarrassed by the attention I received. They'd quickly redirect praise toward Jessica's more conventional accomplishments, as if my academic success was somehow inappropriate to celebrate in mixed company. Jessica, to her credit, never seemed to notice or understand the inequality in our treatment. She genuinely loved me and assumed I was happy living in her shadow because I'd never complained about it openly. She'd often encourage me to be more social, more outgoing, more like her, believing she was offering helpful sisterly advice rather than suggesting I fundamentally change my personality to gain our parents' approval. The summer before I started law school, this dynamic reached its breaking point during what should have been one of the proudest moments of my young life. I'd been accepted to Arizona State University's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law with a partial scholarship based on my LSAT scores and undergraduate performance. The acceptance letter represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and dedication to a dream that had sustained me through countless nights of studying while Jessica was out enjoying her college social life. I remember the moment I decided to share the news with my family. It was a Sunday evening in June, and we were gathered around the dinner table for our weekly family meal at Olive Garden, a tradition Dad had insisted on maintaining even after Jessica and I had moved out. The restaurant buzzed with the usual weekend crowd, families and couples enjoying unlimited breadsticks and casual Italian food in an atmosphere that felt festive without being formal. Jessica had just finished describing her latest client presentation, a campaign for a local car dealership that had resulted in increased sales and praise from her supervisor. Mom and Dad hung on every word, asking follow-up questions and offering enthusiastic congratulations. The conversation naturally lulled as we waited for our entrees to arrive, and I saw my opportunity. I reached into my purse and pulled out the acceptance letter, still crisp and official-looking despite having been folded and unfolded dozens of times since it arrived. My heart pounded as I cleared my throat to get everyone's attention. "I have some news to share," I said, my voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness that should have signaled the importance of what I was about to reveal. Mom looked up from her salad, Dad paused mid-bite of his breadstick, and Jessica smiled encouragingly, probably expecting me to announce a new boyfriend or a summer job. "I got accepted to law school," I continued, holding up the letter like evidence in a court case. "Arizona state law, with a partial scholarship. I'll be starting in the fall." The silence that followed felt like it stretched for hours, though it probably lasted only a few seconds. I watched their faces carefully, hoping to see the pride and excitement I'd been imagining for weeks. Instead, I saw confusion, concern, and something that looked almost like disappointment. Dad was the first to speak, his voice carrying that careful tone parents use when they're trying to discourage a child without being overtly harsh. "Law school, Emma? That's a big commitment. Are you sure you've thought this through completely?" Before I could respond, Mom jumped in with her own concerns. "Honey, law school is so expensive, and it takes 3 years. That's a long time to be in school when you could be starting your career and maybe meeting someone special." Jessica, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source, tried to be supportive in her own way. "That's exciting, Em. But isn't law school super stressful? I've heard lawyers work like 80 hours a week and never have time for family or relationships." I felt my excitement deflating like a punctured balloon. These were the people who were supposed to celebrate my achievements, to share in my dreams and aspirations. Instead, they were treating my acceptance to law school like I'd announced my intention to join a cult or move to another planet. "It's what I've always wanted to do," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I've been preparing for this since high school. My LSAT scores were high enough to get scholarship money, and I've already researched career paths and salary prospects." Dad nodded politely, but his expression remained skeptical. "I'm sure you'll do well academically, sweetheart. You always have. But the legal profession is very competitive, very demanding. Are you sure you have the personality for that kind of cutthroat environment?" The implications stung more than an outright insult would have. He wasn't questioning my intelligence or my work ethic, which were demonstrably strong. He was questioning whether I had the toughness, the assertiveness, the killer instinct that he associated with successful lawyers. In his mind, I was too gentle, too bookish, too nice to succeed in a profession he viewed as inherently aggressive and masculine. Mom tried to soften Dad's concerns, but ended up making things worse. "What your father means is that we worry about you taking on too much stress. You've always been such a perfectionist, and law school is supposed to be incredibly demanding. We just want you to be happy, and happiness doesn't always come from the most prestigious career path." The subtext was clear. They believed I was setting myself up for failure by aiming too high, by wanting something beyond what they considered appropriate for someone like me. They weren't proud of my ambition. They were concerned about it. They weren't excited about my potential. They were worried I would be disappointed when reality failed to meet my expectations. Jessica, still trying to be supportive but influenced by our parents' obvious skepticism, offered what she probably thought was helpful advice. "Maybe you could look into paralegal programs instead? That way you'd still be working in law but without all the pressure and competition. Plus, you'd finish sooner and could start making money right away." I stared at her, realizing that even my sister, who genuinely loved me, couldn't imagine me succeeding at the highest levels of my chosen profession. She was offering me a consolation prize before I'd even started the race. The conversation moved on to other topics after that, but the damage was done. I sat through the rest of dinner, feeling smaller and more invisible than ever before. Here I was, about to embark on one of the most challenging and prestigious graduate programs in the country, and my own family was treating it like a phase I'd grow out of, or a mistake I'd eventually recognize. That night, lying in my childhood, bedroom surrounded by the academic awards and certificates that my parents had never quite known how to celebrate, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I would prove them wrong, not through arguments or confrontations, but through success so undeniable that they would have no choice but to recognize it. I didn't know then that it would take nearly a decade for that moment to arrive, or that, when it finally came, it would happen in a way that none of us could have predicted. I didn't know that the sister whose approval I'd always craved would end up needing my expertise to save her perfect life, or that the parents who worried I was reaching too high would eventually watch me soar far beyond their limited vision of what was possible. All I knew that night was that I was tired of being underestimated, tired of having my dreams dismissed as impractical fantasies, and tired of living in the shadow of someone else's definition of success. Law school wasn't just going to be my education. It was going to be my liberation. The acceptance letter lay on my nightstand, its official letterhead catching the moonlight streaming through my bedroom window. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of transforming myself from the overlooked daughter into something my family couldn't ignore. I just didn't realize yet how completely that transformation would change all of our lives. Law school at Arizona, State's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, was everything my parents had warned me it would be, and absolutely nothing like they'd imagined. The first semester hit me like stepping into a hurricane of intellectual intensity that left me breathless and exhilarated in equal measure. While other students complained about the workload and competitive atmosphere, I thrived in an environment where my analytical mind and obsessive attention to detail were finally assets rather than social liabilities. My classmates were unlike anyone I'd encountered during my undergraduate years. These weren't students coasting through business administration or communications degrees with weekend party schedules. These were individuals who had sacrificed social lives and financial security to pursue something bigger than themselves. Many had already established careers in other fields before deciding to tackle law school, bringing a maturity and focus that elevated every classroom discussion. Professor Martinez taught constitutional law with the intensity of a revival preacher, pacing the front of the lecture hall while dissecting Supreme Court decisions that had shaped American society for generations. When she called on students using the Socratic method, weaker personalities crumbled under the pressure of her rapid-fire questioning. But when those penetrating eyes fixed on me, and she fired off questions about due process or equal protection clauses, I felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before. The law library became my second home, a cathedral of legal knowledge where I could lose myself for 12 hours at a time without feeling guilty about neglecting social obligations. While Jessica was posting Instagram photos from happy hours and weekend getaways, I was buried in case law and legal precedents, building the foundation of expertise that would eventually make me unstoppable in courtrooms across Arizona. My grades reflected my dedication. While the law school curve meant that half the class would receive C's regardless of their actual performance, I consistently earned A's in courses that humbled students who had been academic stars throughout their undergraduate careers. Civil, procedure, contracts, torts, criminal law, constitutional law. Every subject seemed to click for me in ways that surprised even my professors. But academic success in law school wasn't just about memorizing rules and regulations. The real challenge was learning to think like an attorney, to see multiple sides of every argument, to construct compelling legal narratives that could persuade judges and juries. This required a combination of analytical rigor and creative storytelling that perfectly suited my personality. Where Jessica excelled at selling products people wanted to buy, I was learning to sell ideas that could change lives and shape society. The transformation wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply personal. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued the same qualities that had made me feel like an outsider in my own family. My professors appreciated my thoughtful questions and thorough preparation. My study group relied on my research skills and attention to detail. My legal writing instructors praised my ability to construct clear, persuasive arguments that cut through confusion and got to the heart of complex issues. During my second year, I applied for a position on the Arizona State Law Journal, one of the most competitive and prestigious opportunities available to law students. The application process required submitting a lengthy legal analysis paper along with undergraduate transcripts and letters of recommendation. When the acceptance email arrived, I stared at my laptop screen for several minutes, hardly believing that I'd been selected from hundreds of applicants. The law journal experience exposed me to cutting-edge legal scholarship and introduced me to professors and practitioners who were shaping the future of American jurisprudence. My assigned topic was corporate criminal liability, a complex area where business law intersected with criminal prosecution in ways that would later prove crucial to my career trajectory. The research required me to analyze federal court decisions, SEC enforcement actions, and white-collar criminal cases that revealed patterns of corporate misconduct and prosecutorial strategy. As I dove deeper into this specialized area of law, I began to understand how financial crimes were investigated, prosecuted, and defended. The cases I studied weren't abstract legal theories. They were real-world situations where executives faced prison sentences, companies faced bankruptcy, and families lost their life savings due to corporate fraud and embezzlement schemes. The human drama behind these legal proceedings fascinated me in ways that surprised even myself. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family continued to deteriorate as our different life paths became increasingly apparent. Jessica had moved in with her boyfriend Brad, a sales manager at a Ford dealership who seemed nice enough but lacked any intellectual curiosity about the world beyond sports and weekend barbecues. Their conversations revolved around television shows, restaurant reviews, and gossip about mutual friends, topics that felt increasingly foreign to me as I immersed myself in constitutional theory and criminal procedure. Family dinners became exercises in cultural translation. When I tried to share something interesting I'd learned about Fourth Amendment protections or corporate governance regulations, my parents would nod politely before changing the subject to Jessica's latest work, project or vacation plans. When Jessica described her marketing campaigns for local businesses, everyone listened with genuine interest and asked follow-up questions about target demographics and advertising strategies. The disconnect became particularly obvious during my second Christmas break, when I was deep into studying for spring semester exams while Jessica was planning a New Year's Eve party with her college sorority sisters. Mom kept suggesting that I should take a break from studying to join Jessica's social activities, as if maintaining my academic performance was a hobby I could set aside whenever more fun options presented themselves. Dad's concerns were more philosophical, but equally misguided. He worried that I was becoming too serious, too focused on abstract legal concepts instead of practical life skills like maintaining relationships and building social networks. In his mind, Jessica's ability to charm clients and maintain friendships represented emotional intelligence that would serve her better than my academic achievements. He couldn't understand that different people have different strengths and that success comes in many forms. The breaking point came during spring semester of my second year, when I received notification that I'd been selected for a summer internship at Henderson & Associates, one of Phoenix's most prestigious corporate law firms. The internship was unpaid, but it offered exposure to high-stakes litigation and the possibility of a job offer upon graduation. Only 5 law students from Arizona State had been chosen for internship positions at major Phoenix firms, and I was the only second-year student in the group. I called home that evening, expecting my parents to share my excitement about landing such a competitive opportunity. Instead, Dad's first question was whether the internship would interfere with Jessica's wedding planning, which was scheduled for the following summer. Mom worried about whether I'd be able to afford living expenses during an unpaid internship, suggesting that I might be better off finding a paying job at a smaller firm or government office. Their inability to recognize the significance of what I'd achieved crystallized something that had been building inside me for months. They weren't just unsupportive. They were actively discouraging me from pursuing opportunities that could transform my career and my life. Their concern wasn't really about my happiness or financial security. It was about their discomfort with my ambition and their inability to understand success that didn't fit their conventional expectations. That night, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. I would stop seeking their approval and start building something they couldn't ignore. The Henderson & Associates internship would be my entry point into a world where my intelligence and dedication were valued rather than questioned. I would prove myself in that environment, not to make my parents proud, but to establish my own identity as someone who belonged among the most successful attorneys in Arizona. The summer internship exceeded every expectation I'd dared to hold. Henderson & Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Valley of the Sun, stretching toward distant mountains. The offices were decorated with expensive art and furnished with the kind of leather chairs and mahogany conference tables that conveyed serious money and serious power. Partner-level attorneys at Henderson & Associates represented Fortune 500 companies, wealthy individuals facing federal investigations, and corporations navigating complex regulatory environments. These weren't the small-stakes personal injury cases or family law disputes that many people associated with legal practice. This was high-stakes litigation where millions of dollars and executive freedom hung in the balance of carefully crafted legal arguments and courtroom strategy. My supervising attorney was Margaret Chen, a Harvard Law graduate who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. She was brilliant, demanding, and completely uninterested in hand-holding or emotional support. When she assigned me to research a complex issue of securities fraud liability, she expected thorough analysis and creative legal arguments, not excuses about the difficulty of the assignment or requests for additional guidance. Working for Margaret was like attending a masterclass in legal practice taught by someone who had no patience for mediocrity. She showed me how to construct persuasive briefs that anticipated and demolished opposing arguments before they could gain traction. She taught me to identify weaknesses in prosecutorial cases that other attorneys missed, finding procedural errors and constitutional violations that could result in dismissed charges or suppressed evidence. The cases I worked on involved corporate executives accused of accounting fraud, real estate developers charged with money laundering, and investment advisors who had allegedly defrauded wealthy clients. The human stakes were enormous. These were people facing decades in federal prison, families whose reputations and financial security hung in the balance of legal proceedings that could drag on for years. But what struck me most about this work wasn't the drama or the high stakes. It was the intellectual satisfaction of solving complex puzzles that required both legal expertise and strategic thinking. Every case was different, presenting unique challenges that demanded creative solutions and meticulous attention to detail. The work required exactly the kind of analytical intensity and perfectionist tendencies that had made me feel like an outsider in social situations, but that proved invaluable in legal practice. By the end of the summer, Margaret had assigned me increasingly sophisticated tasks, trusting me to draft motions and research briefs that would be filed in federal court under her supervision. When she invited me to observe client meetings and court hearings, I realized that I was being groomed for the kind of legal career that most law students could only dream about. The job offer came during my final week at the firm. Margaret called me into her office and offered me a position as a junior associate beginning after graduation and successful completion of the bar exam. The starting salary was $95,000, more money than Dad had ever earned in his best year selling insurance policies. The position would put me on a partnership track at one of Arizona's most respected law firms, with the potential to earn hundreds of thousands of dollars annually within a few years. I accepted the offer immediately, though I asked Margaret to keep the information confidential until after I passed the bar exam. Something told me that this achievement, like so many others, would be better revealed at the right moment rather than shared prematurely with family members who might find ways to diminish its significance or express concerns about my ability to handle such responsibility. Third year of law school flew by in a blur of advanced coursework, bar exam preparation, and the growing confidence that comes from knowing your professional future is secure. While my classmates stressed about job interviews and uncertain career prospects, I focused on mastering the specialized knowledge that would make me valuable to Henderson and Associates from my first day as a licensed attorney. The bar exam itself was a grueling 2-day ordeal that tested everything I'd learned during 3 years of legal education. When the results were posted 6 weeks later, I wasn't surprised to see my name on the list of successful candidates, but I felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond academic achievement. I was officially an attorney, licensed to practice law in the state of Arizona, ready to begin the career I'd been building toward since that dinner at Olive Garden. When my parents had questioned whether law school was really appropriate for someone like me, my bar admission ceremony was held at the Arizona Supreme Court, where new attorneys took an oath to uphold the Constitution and serve the interests of justice. Mom and Dad attended, along with Jessica and Brad, sitting in the back of the courtroom. As I raised my right hand and officially became Emma Rodriguez, Esquire. They seemed proud but also slightly bewildered, as if they couldn't quite believe that their bookish daughter had achieved something so formal and official. The reception afterward was awkward in ways that perfectly captured our family dynamics. Other new attorneys were surrounded by family members who clearly understood the significance of the occasion, celebrating with champagne and taking dozens of photos to commemorate the achievement. My parents seemed unsure how to react, offering congratulations that felt more obligatory than enthusiastic. Jessica tried to be supportive, but her comments revealed how little she understood about what I'd accomplished. She kept referring to me as so smart and expressing amazement that I'd gotten through law school, as if surviving the experience rather than excelling at it was the remarkable part. When Brad asked what kind of law I'd be practicing, his follow-up questions made it clear that he assumed I'd be handling divorces and car accident cases rather than complex corporate litigation. That evening, I went home to my small apartment near campus and looked at my bar admission certificate, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. In less than a week, I would start work at Henderson and Associates as a junior associate, earning more money than anyone in my family had ever imagined possible. I had the education, the credentials, and the opportunity to build something extraordinary. But I also had the growing realization that my family would probably never truly understand or appreciate what I was building. Their love was genuine, but their vision was limited. And I was beginning to accept that some achievements can't be shared with people who lack the context to understand their significance. I was about to discover just how dramatically success could transform not only my life, but also my family's perception of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Part 3. Building an Empire in Silence. My first day at Henderson and Associates felt like stepping into a different universe, one where my intelligence and dedication weren't just appreciated but expected. The junior associate office I'd been assigned was small, but elegantly appointed, with a view of downtown Phoenix that reminded me every morning how far I'd traveled from that dinner table where my dreams had been dismissed as impractical fantasies. The firm's culture was demanding in ways that would have overwhelmed less dedicated attorneys, but I thrived under the pressure. 14-hour days became routine as I threw myself into cases that required the kind of meticulous research and analytical thinking I'd been developing since law school. While other junior associates complained about the workload or struggled to meet deadlines, I consistently delivered work that exceeded expectations and impressed partners who had little patience for mediocrity. Margaret Chen became more than my supervising attorney. She became my mentor in navigating the complex world of white-collar criminal defense. She taught me that successful attorneys weren't just legal scholars, but strategic thinkers who understood how to build compelling narratives that could sway judges and juries. Every case was a story with heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, and our job was to position our clients as sympathetic figures who deserved mercy rather than punishment. The cases I worked on during my first year were education in how financial crimes were investigated, prosecuted, and defended at the highest levels. I learned to read SEC enforcement actions like detective novels, identifying the investigative techniques that had uncovered evidence, and the legal theories that prosecutors would use to build their cases. I studied federal sentencing guidelines until I could calculate potential prison sentences in my head, understanding exactly what our clients faced if our defense strategies failed. My breakthrough case came during my second year at the firm, when Margaret assigned me to assist with the defense of Robert Blackstone, a real estate developer accused of defrauding investors out of $12 million. The government's case seemed overwhelming at first glance. They had financial records, email communications, and testimony from several cooperating witnesses who painted Blackstone as a master manipulator who had knowingly misrepresented property values and investment returns. But as I dove deeper into the evidence, patterns began to emerge that suggested a different narrative. The government had built their case around the assumption that Blackstone had intentionally deceived investors, but the financial records showed a more complex story of market volatility and unforeseen economic circumstances that had derailed legitimate business plans. The emails that prosecutors characterized as evidence of criminal intent could also be read as the desperate communications of an entrepreneur trying to save failing projects and protect investor interests. I spent 6 months constructing an alternative theory of the case, one that portrayed Blackstone not as a criminal mastermind, but as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, who had made increasingly desperate decisions in an attempt to salvage investments and minimize losses. The research required analyzing hundreds of real estate transactions, market reports, and economic forecasts to demonstrate that Blackstone's initial projections had been reasonable given the information available at the time. When I presented my analysis to Margaret, she stared at the charts and timelines I'd created for several long minutes before looking up with an expression I'd never seen before. "Emma," she said quietly, "this is exceptional work. You've found something that could completely change how we approach this case." The defense strategy I'd developed became the foundation for Blackstone's acquittal on the most serious charges. The jury accepted our argument that while his business decisions had been unsuccessful, they hadn't been criminal. Instead of facing 20 years in federal prison, Blackstone pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor charge and received probation. The case established my reputation within the firm as someone who could find creative solutions to seemingly impossible legal problems. My success on the Blackstone case led to more high-profile assignments and increased responsibility within the firm. Margaret began including me in client meetings and strategy sessions that were typically reserved for senior associates and junior partners. Other partners started requesting my research and analysis on their cases, recognizing that I brought a unique combination of analytical skill and creative thinking to complex legal problems. The financial rewards followed quickly. My salary jumped to $130,000 after my second-year review, with bonuses that brought my total compensation close to $160,000 annually. I moved to a better apartment in Scottsdale, bought a reliable car that didn't require constant repairs, and began building the kind of financial security that my parents had always worried I'd never achieve. But the most significant change was psychological rather than material. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued exactly the qualities that had made me feel like an outsider in my own family. My colleagues appreciated my attention to detail, my willingness to work long hours, and my ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. The traits that Jessica found too serious and my parents considered impractical were the foundation of my professional success. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was building something extraordinary, my family remained largely unaware of what I was achieving. Our interactions had become increasingly superficial as our lives diverged in directions that left us with little common ground for meaningful conversation. When we did see each other at family gatherings, they asked polite questions about my work, but seemed relieved when the conversation moved to topics they found more interesting or comprehensible. Jessica's life was following the predictable trajectory our parents had always envisioned for their daughters. She'd been promoted to senior account executive at her advertising agency, where she managed campaigns for local restaurants and retail stores. Her relationship with Brad had evolved into an engagement, complete with a diamond ring and wedding plans that dominated family conversations for months. Their suburban lifestyle of weekend barbecues and couples game nights represented everything our parents considered normal and healthy. In contrast, my life probably seemed strange and somewhat concerning to them. I worked long hours on cases they didn't understand, earned money from defending people they probably considered criminals, and showed little interest in dating or settling down. When Mom asked about my social life, I struggled to explain that my work was intellectually satisfying in ways that made traditional social activities feel shallow and pointless. The disconnect became particularly apparent during Jessica's engagement party, a lavish celebration at the Phoenician resort that showcased everything about their relationship that our parents found admirable. 200 guests mingled around a poolside reception area decorated with white flowers and string lights, celebrating a love story that had unfolded exactly as romantic comedies and bridal magazines suggested it should. I attended the party, in a borrowed dress, feeling like an anthropologist studying a culture I'd once belonged to but no longer understood. Jessica looked radiant in a flowing blue dress that perfectly complemented her blonde hair and sun-kissed complexion. Brad wore a navy blazer and khaki pants that made him look like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog. They moved through, the crowd with the easy confidence of people who had never questioned whether their choices would lead to happiness and success. The guest list included high school friends, college sorority sisters, co-workers from the advertising agency, and extended family members who seemed genuinely excited about the upcoming wedding. When people asked what I did for work, their polite interest quickly faded when I mentioned corporate law and criminal defense. These weren't people who found legal strategy fascinating or who appreciated the intellectual challenges of complex litigation. Dad's toast that evening crystallized everything about our family dynamics that had driven me to seek success elsewhere. He spoke eloquently about Jessica's achievements, her wonderful personality, and her bright future with Brad. He talked about watching her grow from a beautiful child into a successful young woman who had always made her parents proud. When he mentioned having 2 daughters, it felt like an afterthought rather than an integral part of his message. Later that evening, I overheard a conversation between Jessica's future mother-in-law and my mom that perfectly captured how I was, perceived within our extended family circle. "And your other daughter?" the woman asked. "What does she do?" "Oh, Emma," Mom replied with a slight laugh. "She's still in school, sort of. Going through a very serious phase. We keep hoping she'll meet someone nice and settle down, but she's always buried in those law books." I was 27 years old, earning more than anyone else in our family, and building expertise in one of the most challenging areas of legal practice. But to my own mother, I was still the child going through a phase that she hoped I'd eventually outgrow. That night, driving home through the desert darkness toward my Scottsdale apartment, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my career and my relationship with my family. I would stop trying to bridge the gap between their world and mine. I would focus entirely on building something so undeniably successful that they would have no choice but to recognize my achievements, even if they never truly understood them. The opportunity came sooner than I expected, in the form of a case that would establish my reputation not just within Henderson and Associates, but throughout Arizona's legal community. Margaret assigned me to lead the defense of Patricia Williams, a former bank executive accused of embezzling $2.3 million from customer accounts over a period of 4 years. The case had attracted significant media attention because Williams had been a prominent figure in Phoenix's business community, serving on nonprofit boards and hosting charity fundraisers that had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for local causes. The government's case seemed airtight at first examination. They had financial records showing unauthorized transfers from customer accounts, email communications discussing the movement of funds, and testimony from bank employees who described Williams's unusual access to restricted accounts. Federal. Prosecutors were seeking a 20-year sentence that would effectively end Williams' life as she knew it. But as I studied the evidence more carefully, I began to notice inconsistencies and gaps that suggested the government's narrative might be incomplete. The financial records showed unusual patterns of account access and fund transfers, but they also revealed a complex web of legitimate business relationships and authorized transactions that complicated the picture of straightforward embezzlement. The email communications that prosecutors cited as evidence of criminal intent could also be interpreted as routine business correspondence about legitimate banking operations. Most importantly, I discovered that the bank's own internal controls had been compromised by a computer system upgrade that had occurred during the period when the alleged embezzlement took place. The new system had created temporary vulnerabilities in account security and audit trails that could have been exploited by someone other than Williams. This possibility had apparently been overlooked by both the bank's internal investigation and the federal agents who had built the prosecution case. My investigation into the computer system vulnerabilities required consulting with cybersecurity experts and forensic accountants who could analyze the technical aspects of how the embezzlement might have occurred. The research consumed 6 months of 18-hour days, but it ultimately revealed evidence that cast serious doubt on the government's theory of the case. When I presented my findings to the prosecution team, they initially dismissed my alternative theory as desperate defense tactics, but the technical evidence I'd assembled was too comprehensive to ignore, and the possibility of prosecuting an innocent person while the real perpetrator remained free eventually forced them to reconsider their position. The case was resolved through a plea agreement that acknowledged Williams' administrative responsibility for the bank's security failures while recognizing that she had not been the primary architect of the embezzlement scheme. Instead of 20 years in federal prison, she received 5 years of probation and restitution payments that reflected her supervisory role rather than criminal intent. The Williams case established my reputation as someone who could find creative solutions to seemingly impossible legal problems. Legal publications wrote articles about the innovative defense strategy I'd developed, and other attorneys began referring complex cases to Henderson and Associates specifically because they wanted me to work on them. My name appeared in legal journals and conference presentations as an example of how thorough investigation and creative thinking could overcome overwhelming prosecutorial advantages. Margaret nominated me for early partnership consideration, an honor typically reserved for attorneys with at least 7 years of experience. At 29, I was being recognized as one of the most promising criminal defense attorneys in Arizona, with a track record of success that would have been remarkable for someone with twice my experience. The partnership decision was scheduled for discussion during the firm's annual retreat in Sedona, where the senior partners would evaluate candidates for advancement to the firm's leadership ranks. Margaret warned me that early partnership was extremely rare, and that some partners might prefer to wait until I had more experience. But she also assured me that my work on recent cases had impressed everyone who had seen it, and that my chances were better than most candidates who waited for the traditional timeline. The night before the partnership meeting, I sat on the balcony of my hotel room looking out at the red rock formations that surrounded Sedona, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Less than 5 years earlier, I'd been a law student whose own parents questioned whether she could handle the pressure of legal practice. Now I was being considered for partnership at one of Arizona's most prestigious law firms, with the potential to earn hundreds of thousands of Dollars annually, while working on cases that could shape legal precedent and determine the fates of powerful people. The partnership vote was unanimous. Every senior partner agreed that my contributions to the firm's success and my potential for future growth justified early advancement to the partnership ranks. At 29, I became the youngest partner in Henderson & Associates history, with an equity stake in the firm and profit-sharing arrangements that would make me wealthy by any reasonable standard. But perhaps more importantly, I had achieved something that transcended financial success or professional recognition. I had built an identity that was entirely my own, based on abilities and achievements that nobody could diminish or dismiss. I was no longer the overlooked daughter or the impractical dreamer. I was Emma Rodriguez, partner at Henderson & Associates, one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in Arizona. The irony was that my family remained largely unaware of what I had accomplished. They knew I worked at a law firm and assumed I was doing reasonably well, but they had no understanding of the significance of early partnership or the kinds of cases I was handling. When I mentioned my promotion during a family dinner, their congratulations were polite but superficial, lacking the enthusiasm they had shown for Jessica's engagement or Brad's promotion to sales manager at the Ford dealership. I realized that their inability to appreciate my success was no longer painful. It was simply irrelevant. I had found validation and recognition in a world where my achievements mattered, where my intelligence and dedication were valued rather than questioned. I no longer needed their approval because I had something far more valuable: my own self-respect and the respect of colleagues who understood what I had accomplished. I had no way of knowing that within 3 years, the same family members who had dismissed my career as impractical would be desperately calling for my help, facing problems that only my expertise could solve. I couldn't have predicted that the skills they had never understood would become their salvation, or that the success they had never acknowledged would ultimately determine their family's survival. All I knew was that I had built something extraordinary, and that was enough. Part 4. When everything changes. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as I was reviewing a complex motion to suppress evidence in a high-profile securities fraud case. I'd been a partner at Henderson & Associates for 2 years, and my reputation in Arizona's legal community had grown to the point where prosecutors often settled cases rather than face me in court. My calendar was booked months in advance with clients who specifically requested my representation, and my annual income had reached levels that would have seemed impossible when I was struggling through law school. Jessica's name appeared on my phone screen, which was unusual enough to make me pause. We hadn't spoken in several months, our lives having diverged to the point where meaningful communication had become difficult. She lived in suburban Chandler, with Brad, planning their wedding and managing her marketing accounts, while I occupied a world of federal courtrooms and white-collar criminal defense that might as well have been on another planet. When I answered the call, the sound that came through the speaker was barely recognizable as my sister's voice. Instead of her usual bright cheerfulness, I heard broken sobs and panicked breathing that made my stomach clench with immediate concern. "Emma," she managed to say between gasps, "I need help." Real help. I don't know what to do. The story that emerged over the next 20 minutes was a nightmare that perfectly illustrated how quickly a comfortable middle-class life could collapse into criminal liability and financial ruin. Tyler Morrison, Jessica's fiancé, had been running what appeared to be a successful construction consulting business, advising developers on project management and regulatory compliance. What Jessica hadn't known was that Tyler had been systematically inflating invoices, creating fictitious subcontractors, and diverting client funds into personal accounts for nearly 3 years. The scheme had unraveled when a major client conducted an internal audit and discovered discrepancies between the services Tyler had billed and the work that had actually been completed. Further investigation revealed a pattern of fraud that totaled nearly $800,000 across multiple clients and projects. The Arizona Attorney General's office had opened a criminal investigation, and federal agents were examining whether the scheme involved mail fraud or other federal crimes that could result in prosecution in federal court. Tyler faced potential charges of theft, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, with combined penalties that could result in decades in state or federal prison. The wedding that had been planned for September was now overshadowed by the possibility that the groom would be incarcerated by then. Jessica's perfect life had disintegrated into a legal and financial catastrophe that threatened everything she had worked to build. But the personal devastation was only part of the crisis. Tyler's criminal exposure had created civil liability for Jessica because Arizona law allowed victims to pursue restitution from anyone who had benefited from criminal proceeds. The house they had purchased together, the cars, the engagement ring, even the wedding deposits could potentially be seized to compensate Tyler's victims. Jessica faced the possibility of losing everything she owned while also being associated with a criminal case that could destroy her professional reputation and social standing. As Jessica's sobs gradually subsided into exhausted silence, I found myself in the strange position of being the person my family had always underestimated, suddenly becoming their only hope for salvation. The legal expertise they had never understood or appreciated was now their lifeline in a crisis that could destroy everything they had built together. "I need you to represent Tyler," Jessica said, her voice small and desperate. "Mom said maybe you'd know someone, some criminal lawyer who could help us. We don't have much money left after the legal fees we've already paid, but we'll figure something out. Please, Emma. I don't know where else to turn." The irony was almost overwhelming. For 30 years, my family had treated my legal career as an interesting hobby that might someday lead to a respectable job handling wills and divorces. They had worried that I was too serious, too focused on abstract legal theories instead of practical life skills. Now the same sister who had suggested I consider paralegal training was begging me to save her fiancé from criminal prosecution using exactly the expertise they had never valued. I could have reminded Jessica of all the times my achievements had been dismissed or my ambitions had been questioned. I could have pointed out that the legal skills they were now desperately seeking were the same ones they had considered impractical and overly ambitious. I could have taken satisfaction in the reversal of fortune that had made me the powerful one while they faced destruction. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'll review Tyler's case personally. Send me everything you have. Police reports, financial, records, witness statements, everything. I'll need to meet with Tyler as soon as possible to understand exactly what happened and what we're dealing with." The relief in Jessica's voice was palpable. For the first time in our adult lives, she was looking up to me instead of the other way around. The little sister who had always felt inadequate was suddenly the family's salvation, the one person with the knowledge and connections to navigate the criminal justice system that threatened to destroy their lives. That afternoon, I cleared my calendar and drove to Jessica and Tyler's house in Chandler, a modest suburban development where every home looked essentially identical, except for minor variations in landscaping and exterior paint colors. The house that had represented their successful transition to adult independence now felt like a fortress under siege, with legal documents scattered across the dining room table and boxes of financial records stacked in the living room corners. Tyler looked like he had aged 5 years in the past month. The confident, slightly arrogant young man who had always treated me like Jessica's weird little sister was now a frightened defendant facing the possibility of decades in prison. When he shook my hand, his palms were damp with nervous sweat, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had finally realized that actions have consequences. As I reviewed the government's evidence, the scope of Tyler's criminal exposure became clear. This wasn't a case of poor record-keeping or aggressive business practices that had crossed ethical lines. This was systematic fraud that had been carefully planned and executed over multiple years, with evidence that included bank records, email communications, and witness testimony that would be devastating in front of a jury. The federal government was building a case under the mail fraud statute, which carried a maximum penalty of 20 years per count. With multiple counts involving different clients and different fraudulent schemes, Tyler potentially faced life. in prison if convicted on all charges. The state charges were equally serious, with Arizona's theft and fraud statutes providing for lengthy prison sentences that would effectively end his life as a free man. But as I studied the case more carefully, I began to identify weaknesses in the government's evidence and opportunities for creative defense strategies. The prosecution had built their case around financial records and email communications, but they had made assumptions about Tyler's intent and knowledge that might not withstand scrutiny in court. Some of the alleged fraudulent activities could potentially be characterized as legitimate business practices that had been misunderstood by clients who lacked expertise in construction project management. More importantly, the government's investigation had focused on Tyler as the primary perpetrator, without thoroughly examining whether other parties might have been involved in the fraudulent activities. Some of the financial irregularities pointed toward subcontractors and suppliers who might have been complicit in the scheme or who might have been conducting their own fraudulent activities without Tyler's knowledge. The complexity of the case required the kind of detailed investigation and creative legal thinking that had made my reputation in Arizona's criminal defense community. This wasn't a case that could be resolved through plea negotiations or routine defense strategies. It required the full deployment of skills that had taken me years to develop and that few attorneys possessed. Over the next 6 weeks, I constructed a defense strategy that reframed the government's narrative in ways that created reasonable doubt about Tyler's criminal intent and the scope of his personal responsibility. Instead of the calculating fraudster portrayed in the prosecution's evidence, I presented Tyler as an overwhelmed businessman who had made increasingly desperate decisions as his legitimate consulting business faced financial pressures beyond his control. The strategy required hiring forensic accountants to analyze the financial records, construction experts to evaluate the legitimacy of Tyler's consulting services, and private investigators to examine the backgrounds and motivations of prosecution witnesses. The defense costs quickly mounted into 6 figures, expenses that Jessica and Tyler couldn't possibly afford on their combined salaries. I made a decision that surprised even myself. I would represent Tyler pro bono, absorbing all defense costs as my personal contribution to resolving the crisis that threatened to destroy my sister's life. The financial investment was substantial, requiring me to front expenses that would eventually total nearly $200,000 for expert witnesses, forensic analysis, and investigative services. But I had reached a point in my career where such expenditures were manageable, and more importantly, I recognized this case as an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that my family had never understood or appreciated. The first challenge was gaining Tyler's complete cooperation in developing our defense strategy. During our initial meetings, he had been evasive about certain aspects of his business operations, apparently believing that admitting mistakes to his defense attorney might somehow be used against him. I had to explain repeatedly that attorney-client privilege meant I couldn't reveal anything he told me, and that building an effective defense required absolute honesty about every detail of his business practices. The breakthrough came during our 4th meeting, when Tyler finally acknowledged that his construction consulting business had been struggling financially for nearly 2 years before he began the fraudulent activities. Rising costs, increased competition, and several major clients who had defaulted on payments had created cash flow problems that threatened to bankrupt his company and destroy his reputation in the construction industry. Rather than seeking legitimate business solutions or filing for bankruptcy protection, Tyler had begun padding invoices and creating fictitious expenses as a temporary measure to maintain operations while he searched for new clients and revenue sources. The fraudulent activities had escalated gradually over time, with each new scheme designed to cover losses from previous deceptions until the entire structure became unsustainable. This information allowed me to construct a defense narrative that acknowledged Tyler's wrongdoing while presenting it as the desperate actions of someone facing financial ruin, rather than the calculated greed of a career criminal. The distinction was crucial for sentencing purposes, as federal guidelines provided for significantly reduced penalties when defendants could demonstrate that their crimes were motivated by financial necessity rather than simple avarice. The forensic accounting analysis I commissioned revealed patterns in Tyler's financial records that supported our defense theory. The fraudulent activities had coincided with periods of legitimate business stress, and the amounts involved had been relatively modest compared to the overall volume of his consulting operations. Most importantly, Tyler had used the fraudulent proceeds primarily to maintain business operations and pay employee salaries rather than funding lavish personal expenditures. Meanwhile, I was managing this complex criminal defense while maintaining my regular caseload at Henderson and Associates. My partners had been understanding about the time commitment required for Tyler's case, recognizing that high-profile pro bono work enhanced the firm's reputation and demonstrated our commitment to community service. But the dual demands meant I was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week for months at a time. The personal toll was significant but manageable, because I was finally doing work that my family could understand and appreciate. For the first time in my adult life, Jessica called me regularly, not to make small talk or fulfill family obligations, but because she genuinely needed my expertise and guidance. She asked detailed questions about legal procedures, timeline expectations, and strategic decisions, treating me as the professional expert I had become rather than the impractical dreamer she had always assumed I was. My parents' reactions were more complex and revealing. Dad struggled to reconcile his long-held assumptions about my capabilities with the reality of my leading a high-stakes criminal defense that could determine their future son-in-law's freedom. He attended several court hearings, sitting in the gallery and watching me argue motions and cross-examine witnesses with a skill and confidence that obviously surprised him. After one particularly successful hearing where I had convinced the judge to suppress key evidence based on Fourth Amendment violations, Dad approached me in the courthouse hallway with an expression I had never seen before. "Emma," he said quietly, "I had no idea you were capable of this level of professional performance. I'm genuinely impressed by what you've accomplished." The acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected, representing decades of validation that I had long ago stopped seeking, but apparently still craved on some deep psychological level. But it also highlighted how completely my family had underestimated my abilities and achievements throughout my career. They were impressed by my courtroom performance because they had never imagined I possessed such capabilities, despite years of evidence that should have indicated my professional competence. Mom's response was different, but equally telling. She began introducing me to friends and neighbors as my daughter the lawyer, emphasizing my professional credentials in ways she had never done before. When Jessica's friends asked about the legal proceedings, Mom would defer to my expertise, explaining that I was handling everything and that Tyler was fortunate to have such skilled representation. The transformation in family dynamics was gradual, but unmistakable. Instead of being the overlooked daughter whose achievements were minimized or ignored, I had become the family member everyone turned to for guidance and support. My opinions carried weight in family discussions, my professional schedule was accommodated rather than questioned, and my expertise was sought rather than dismissed. The federal prosecution team initially approached Tyler's case with the confidence typical of white-collar criminal cases where the evidence appears overwhelming. Financial records, email communications, and witness testimony seemed to provide a clear narrative of systematic fraud that would be difficult to challenge in court. Lead prosecutor Amanda Richardson had successfully handled dozens of similar cases and had no reason to expect unusual difficulties with Tyler's prosecution. But as our defense investigation progressed, and I began filing pre-trial motions challenging various aspects of the government's case, Richardson's confidence began to erode. My motion to suppress evidence obtained through a search warrant challenged the probable cause foundation for the search, arguing that the affidavit contained material misstatements about Tyler's business operations. My motion to dismiss certain charges argued that the government had misinterpreted Arizona's construction consulting regulations in ways that criminalized legitimate business practices. Most importantly, my discovery motions forced the prosecution to reveal weaknesses in their investigation that they had hoped to conceal until trial. I demanded access to all communications between government agents and prosecution witnesses, financial records for the construction companies that had allegedly been defrauded, and internal documents from the Arizona Attorney General's office regarding their investigation priorities and resource allocation. The materials I obtained through discovery revealed that the government's case was less solid than initial appearances suggested. Several prosecution witnesses had their own legal problems that might have motivated them to cooperate with investigators in exchange for lenient treatment. Some of the financial losses attributed to Tyler's fraudulent activities were actually the result of separate business disputes and market conditions that had nothing to do with his consulting services. Richardson began reaching out to discuss plea negotiations much earlier than typically occurred in federal white-collar cases. Her initial offers were harsh, requiring Tyler to plead guilty to multiple felony charges and accept a prison sentence of 8 to 10 years. But as I continued to challenge different aspects of their case, and her supervisors began questioning whether they could secure convictions on all charges, the offers became progressively more reasonable. The breakthrough in plea negotiations came when I presented evidence that some of Tyler's alleged fraudulent activities had actually been authorized by client representatives who had since left their companies and were unavailable to testify. Internal emails I had obtained through discovery showed that certain billing practices the government characterized as fraudulent had been explicitly approved by project managers who understood the nature of the charges. This evidence created reasonable doubt about Tyler's criminal intent that could have resulted in jury acquittal on several charges. Richardson's supervisors began pressuring her to resolve the case through plea negotiations rather than risk the embarrassment of losing. A high-profile prosecution that had attracted significant media attention. The final plea agreement represented a dramatic victory that transformed Tyler's legal exposure from decades in federal prison to a manageable sentence that would allow him to rebuild his life. Instead of the original charges that carried maximum penalties of over 30 years, Tyler pleaded guilty to a single felony count of mail fraud with an agreed sentence of 18 months in minimum security federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. The financial restitution requirements were equally favorable, requiring Tyler to pay back approximately $300,000 over a 5-year period, rather than the full amount the government had initially demanded. The structured payment plan meant Tyler could maintain employment after his release from prison and gradually restore his financial standing without facing perpetual debt obligations. Jessica's relief when I explained the plea agreement terms was overwhelming. She had spent months fearing that Tyler would receive a 20-year sentence that would effectively end their relationship and their plans for marriage and family. The 18-month sentence meant they could postpone their wedding until after his release, but still build the life together they had planned. But perhaps more importantly for our family dynamics, the successful resolution of Tyler's case established my credibility and expertise in ways that decades of professional achievements had never accomplished. My parents could finally understand what I had been building throughout my career, because they had witnessed firsthand how my legal skills had saved their future son-in-law from catastrophic consequences. Dad's perspective on my career underwent a complete transformation. Instead of worrying that I was too serious or too focused on abstract legal concepts, he began bragging to friends and colleagues about my courtroom victories and professional recognition. He started reading legal publications to better understand the cases I was working on, and he asked informed questions about legal strategies and criminal defense tactics. Mom's response was equally dramatic. She began collecting newspaper articles about my cases and professional achievements, creating a scrapbook of legal coverage that she displayed prominently in their living room. When neighbors or friends asked about her daughters, she now spoke about Jessica's marketing career and my legal practice with equal pride and enthusiasm. The most significant change was in my relationship with Jessica herself. The crisis had forced her to see me as something other than her weird little sister who spent too much time studying. She had witnessed my professional competence under extreme pressure my willingness to sacrifice financially for family interests, and my ability to achieve results that literally saved their future together. "I never understood what you were doing all those years," she told me one evening, as we sat in her living room, surrounded by legal documents that would soon be filed away as Tyler's case reached its conclusion. "I thought you were just being antisocial, avoiding real life by hiding behind books and legal theories. But you were building something incredible, something that ended up saving us when we needed it most." The acknowledgement represented a fundamental shift in how my family understood my life choices and career trajectory. They finally recognized that the intellectual intensity and professional dedication they had once viewed as character flaws were actually the foundation of expertise that could solve problems they couldn't handle themselves. But even as I savored this long overdue recognition, I realized that my relationship with my family had been permanently altered by the crisis and its resolution. I was no longer the overlooked daughter seeking approval and validation from people who didn't understand my aspirations. I had become the family member everyone turned to when serious problems required sophisticated solutions. The power dynamic that had defined our relationships for 3 decades had completely reversed. Instead of being the person who needed their support and encouragement, I was now the person they depended on for guidance and protection. The transformation was satisfying in some ways, but also isolating, as it created new barriers to the casual, equal relationships I had always hoped to have with my family members. Tyler's sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning in the federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix. I had prepared extensively for this final court appearance, submitting character letters, financial documentation, and legal memoranda, designed to persuade the judge that Tyler deserved the minimum sentence allowed under our plea agreement. The courtroom was packed with family members, friends, and business associates who had come to support Tyler during this crucial moment. Jessica sat in the front row directly behind the defense table, her hands clasped tightly as she watched the proceedings that would determine their immediate future. My parents sat beside her, their expressions reflecting a mixture of anxiety and confidence in my ability to advocate effectively for Tyler's interests. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Tyler despite the shared surname, had a reputation for fairness and thorough consideration of all factors relevant to sentencing decisions. She had reviewed all the materials I had submitted and had asked thoughtful questions during pre-sentencing conferences that suggested she understood the complexities of Tyler's case. When the time came for me to present Tyler's sentencing argument, I addressed the court with the confidence and expertise that had been developed through years of high-stakes litigation. I explained how Tyler's crimes had resulted from financial desperation rather than greed, how he had accepted responsibility for his actions and cooperated fully with the investigation, and how the proposed sentence would achieve the goals of punishment and deterrence without destroying his ability to make meaningful restitution to his victims. Judge Morrison listened attentively to my arguments and asked several questions that demonstrated her careful consideration of the factors I had presented. When she announced Tyler's sentence, it was exactly what we had negotiated in the plea agreement: 18 months in minimum security federal prison, followed by supervised probation and structured restitution payments. The relief in the courtroom was palpable. Jessica began crying tears of joy and gratitude, while my parents looked stunned that such a serious criminal case had been resolved so favorably. Tyler himself seemed unable to believe that his nightmare was finally ending with a sentence that would allow him to rebuild his life. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, Dad approached me with an expression of profound respect and gratitude. "Emma," he said, "I don't think we can ever fully thank you for what you've done for our family. You saved Tyler's life, and you saved Jessica's future. I'm ashamed that it took this crisis for us to recognize how remarkable you are." The acknowledgement was gratifying, but it also highlighted the fundamental tragedy of our family relationships. They had needed to see me save them from disaster before they could appreciate the expertise I had been building throughout my entire adult life. Their pride in my achievements was genuine, but also painfully belated, coming only after they had personally benefited from the skills they had previously dismissed as impractical or overly ambitious. That evening, as I sat in my Scottsdale apartment, reviewing files for my next case, I reflected on how dramatically the Tyler Morrison case had changed my family's perception of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. For the first time in my adult life, they saw me as someone powerful and competent, rather than someone who needed their guidance and concern. But I also realized that their newfound respect, while satisfying, couldn't erase decades of feeling undervalued and misunderstood. The validation I had always sought from them had finally arrived, but it came too late to fill the emotional void that their earlier dismissal had created. I had learned to find satisfaction and purpose in professional achievement and peer recognition, rather than family approval. The real victory wasn't Tyler's favorable sentence or my family's belated acknowledgement of my capabilities. The real victory was the realization that I had built something extraordinary without their support or understanding, and that their opinion of my achievements was no longer necessary for my sense of self-worth and professional identity. I had become the person I was always meant to be, and their recognition was simply a bonus rather than a necessity. The transformation was complete, and I was finally free from the need for their validation that had driven so much of my early career development. Within 6 months, Tyler would begin serving his sentence. Jessica would start planning their post-incarceration wedding, and my family would return to their normal routines with a new understanding of my professional capabilities. But the real story was just beginning, as the legal expertise they had witnessed during Tyler's case would soon be needed again in ways none of us could have predicted. The skills that had saved Tyler from decades in federal prison were about to be tested in an even more dramatic fashion, when a crisis that threatened everything my family had worked to build would require not just my legal expertise, but my financial resources and business connections in ways that would transform all of our lives forever. But that transformation was still months away, as the autumn of Tyler's sentencing gave way to a winter where everyone assumed our family crisis had been permanently resolved. None of us realized that the most dramatic chapter of our story was yet to be written, and that the legal skills I had demonstrated in Tyler's case were merely preparation for challenges that would test everything I had learned about criminal defense, family loyalty, and the price of success. The phone call that would change everything was still months away, but when it came, it would require every skill I had developed and every resource I had accumulated during my transformation from overlooked daughter to successful attorney. The family that had finally learned to respect my achievements was about to discover that they would need me in ways that went far beyond legal representation, and that the power dynamic, which had been completely reversed during Tyler's case, was about to shift even more dramatically. The story of my professional success and family recognition was complete, but the story of how that success would be tested by circumstances none of us could have imagined was just beginning to unfold. The 18 months of Tyler's federal incarceration passed more quickly than anyone had expected. Jessica visited him every weekend at the minimum security facility in Tucson, maintaining their relationship through a combination of determination and genuine love that surprised even skeptics who had predicted their engagement wouldn't survive the criminal proceedings. During those months, she worked overtime at her marketing agency to save money for their post-release wedding, while I continued building my practice and reputation in Arizona's legal community. Tyler's early release for good behavior meant he was home 6 weeks before their scheduled wedding date, giving them time to finalize arrangements for a celebration that had been planned around uncertainty for nearly 2 years. The venue was the Arizona Biltmore Resort, a stunning Art Deco property in Phoenix that had hosted presidents and celebrities since the 1920s. Jessica had dreamed of being married there since high school, and Tyler's successful completion of his sentence felt like validation that their love story deserved such an elegant setting. My role in their wedding was deliberately understated. Jessica had asked me to be her maid of honor, but I had declined, suggesting instead that her college roommate Sarah fulfill that traditional role while I simply attended as family. The decision reflected my growing understanding that while my family now respected my professional achievements, our relationships remained complex and somewhat fragile. I preferred to maintain some emotional distance rather than risk disappointment if old patterns of dismissal and misunderstanding resurfaced. The wedding preparations revealed how dramatically Tyler's legal troubles had changed his perspective on life and relationships. Gone was the cocky arrogance that had characterized his interactions with me during our early acquaintance. In its place was a genuine humility and gratitude that extended not just to me for my legal representation, but to everyone who had supported him and Jessica during their crisis. He had learned expensive lessons about honesty, consequences, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who possess skills you lack. My parents threw themselves into wedding preparations with enthusiasm that reflected their relief at seeing Jessica's happiness restored and their pride in having a daughter whose legal expertise had made the celebration possible. Dad upgraded his tuxedo rental to include a vest and bow tie that made him look distinguished and paternal. Mom spent weeks shopping for the perfect mother-of-the-bride dress, eventually selecting a navy blue ensemble that complemented Jessica's color scheme. While maintaining appropriate formality, the guest list included 300 people representing different phases of Jessica and Tyler's lives: college friends, work colleagues, extended family members, neighbors, and childhood acquaintances who had watched their relationship develop over several years. Many of these guests were aware of Tyler's legal troubles and imprisonment, viewing the wedding as a celebration of redemption and second chances, rather than simply romantic love. I selected my own wedding attire carefully, choosing a burgundy silk dress that was elegant without being attention-grabbing, sophisticated without being overly formal. The goal was to blend seamlessly into the celebration while maintaining the professional image that had become integral to my identity. I was no longer the awkward younger sister who felt uncomfortable at social gatherings. I was a successful attorney who could navigate any social situation with confidence and grace. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful and moving, held in the resort's outdoor garden pavilion, surrounded by desert landscaping and mountain views that provided a stunning, natural backdrop. Jessica looked radiant in a flowing white gown that emphasized her natural beauty, while Tyler appeared genuinely emotional as he spoke vows that referenced their recent challenges and his gratitude for her unwavering support during his imprisonment. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause from 300 guests was thunderous and heartfelt. Everyone present understood that this marriage represented more than romantic commitment. It symbolized resilience, forgiveness, and the power of love to survive extraordinary challenges. Jessica and Tyler had earned their happiness through adversity that would have destroyed weaker relationships. The reception was held in the resort's grand ballroom, decorated with white flowers and gold accents that created an atmosphere of understated elegance. Round tables for 10 guests each were arranged around a spacious dance floor, with a head table for the wedding party positioned on a slightly elevated platform that provided clear sightlines for toasts and speeches. I was seated at a table, with family friends and distant relatives, people who knew me primarily as Jessica's younger sister rather than as a successful attorney. The conversation was pleasant but superficial, focusing on wedding details, vacation plans, and local news rather than the substantive topics that dominated my professional life. I was content to listen and observe, enjoying the celebration without feeling compelled to dominate conversations or prove my intellectual superiority. The evening's first surprise came during the cocktail hour, when I was approached by Mark Stevens, one of Tyler's college fraternity brothers who had flown in from Los Angeles for the wedding. Mark was tall and athletic, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from success in business and comfort in social situations. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. "You must be Emma," he said. "Tyler told me you're the attorney who saved his life. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for him and Jessica. Not many people would have taken on such a complex case pro bono, especially for family members who probably hadn't always appreciated their talents." The comment was perceptive and diplomatically phrased, suggesting that Mark understood family dynamics without being inappropriately personal about relationships he could only observe from outside. His gratitude seemed genuine rather than obligatory, reflecting the loyalty that Tyler's friends felt toward someone who had demonstrated such dedication during a difficult period. "Tyler's a good person who made some poor decisions," I replied. "Everyone deserves competent legal representation, and I was in a position to provide it. I'm glad everything worked out well for both of them." Mark nodded approvingly at my response, which avoided both false modesty and excessive self-congratulation. "Tyler mentioned that you specialize in white-collar criminal defense. That must be fascinating work, complex cases with high stakes and sophisticated legal strategies." The conversation continued for several minutes, covering topics that ranged from recent Supreme Court decisions affecting criminal procedure to the challenges of building a successful law practice in a competitive market. Mark demonstrated genuine knowledge about legal issues and asked thoughtful questions that went beyond superficial curiosity. I found myself enjoying the intellectual exchange in ways that were rare at social gatherings. As our conversation progressed, Mark mentioned that he was recently engaged to a wonderful woman named Jennifer, who worked as a federal prosecutor in the Central District of California. "Actually," he said with a laugh, "Jennifer's sister is marrying a federal judge next month. James Morrison. Maybe you know him? He's based in the Ninth Circuit but handles cases throughout the western states." The name hit me like an electric shock, though I managed to maintain my composure while processing this unexpected connection. James Morrison wasn't just any federal judge. He was my fiancé, the man I had been quietly dating for 8 months and had agreed to marry just 6 weeks earlier. We had kept our relationship private, partly due to the sensitive nature of his judicial position, and partly because I preferred to maintain separation between my personal life and my professional reputation. "I do know Judge Morrison," I said carefully, testing how much Mark might know about James's personal life. "He has an excellent reputation in the legal community. Your fiancé's sister is very fortunate." Mark's expression suddenly changed as he processed something in my response. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. "You're not just familiar with James Morrison professionally, are you? Tyler mentioned that you're engaged to someone, but he didn't say who. Please tell me you're not." "I am," I said with a smile that I couldn't suppress. "James and I are getting married next spring. Jennifer will be my sister-in-law, which means you and I will be connected through marriage as well as through Tyler and Jessica." The coincidence was remarkable enough to make both of us laugh, but Mark's next comment revealed information that would transform the entire evening. "Emma, do you realize that James's family owns Morrison Enterprises? He's not just a federal judge. He's heir to one of the largest private equity firms on the West Coast. His personal net worth is estimated at over $300 million. I knew about James's family wealth, of course, but I'd never discussed specific numbers or made it a focus of our relationship. We had met at a legal conference where we were both speaking about criminal justice reform, and our connection had been intellectual and emotional rather than financial. The money was simply background information that had little relevance to our compatibility or future together. But Mark's revelation meant that my family, who still viewed me as someone whose career was proceeding adequately but unremarkably, was about to learn that I was marrying into wealth that exceeded their most extravagant fantasies. More importantly, they were about to discover this information in a public setting where their shock and surprise would be witnessed by 300 wedding guests. "Most people don't know about James's family background," I said to Mark. "He prefers to be recognized for his judicial work rather than his inherited wealth. I'd appreciate it if you'd be discreet about sharing that information." Mark nodded, understandingly, but I could see that he was struggling to process the implications of what he had learned. Here was Tyler's criminal defense attorney, someone he had viewed as competent but not particularly remarkable, revealed to be engaged to one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the federal judiciary. The evening's second surprise came an hour later, during the dinner service, when Tyler approached our table with Jessica in tow. They were making rounds to thank guests for attending and to share their happiness with everyone who had supported them during their recent difficulties. "Emma," Tyler said, his voice carrying genuine warmth and gratitude, "I want to introduce you to some people who flew in from out of state for the wedding. This is Mark Stevens, one of my fraternity brothers, from college." "Actually," Mark said with a grin, "Emma and I have already met. We've been having a fascinating conversation about federal criminal procedure and judicial appointments. It turns out we have more connections than anyone realized." Tyler looked puzzled by Mark's comment, sensing undertones he couldn't identify. "What kind of connections?" Mark glanced at me, silently asking permission to reveal what he had learned during our conversation. When I nodded slightly, he continued, "Well, it turns out that Emma is engaged to my future sister-in-law's fiancé. Small world, right?" Tyler's confusion deepened rather than clarified. "I'm not sure I follow. Emma, you're engaged? When did that happen? And how does that connect to Mark?" I realized that the moment of revelation had arrived unexpectedly, without the careful preparation I might have preferred. "I've been dating federal Judge James Morrison for the past 8 months, I said calmly. "We got engaged 6 weeks ago. Mark's fiancée Jennifer is a federal prosecutor whose sister is also marrying Judge Morrison. Different Morrison, no relation to you, Tyler." The silence that followed my announcement seemed to stretch forever, though it probably lasted only a few seconds. Tyler's expression shifted from confusion to shock, to something approaching awe as he processed the implications of what I had revealed. Jessica's mouth fell open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. "You're marrying a federal judge," Jessica whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the information untrue. "James is a wonderful man," I replied. "We met at a legal conference and discovered that we share similar perspectives on criminal justice reform and constitutional interpretation. The relationship developed naturally from there." Tyler was still struggling to process this new information about someone he thought he knew well. "Emma, federal judges are appointed by the President of the United States. They serve lifetime appointments on the federal bench. How did you even meet someone like that?" James was speaking at the same American Bar Association conference where I presented research on white-collar criminal defense strategies, I explained. We ended up having dinner together to discuss mutual interests in legal reform, and the relationship grew from there. Mark, who had been watching this family revelation with obvious fascination, decided to add information that would make the situation even more dramatic. "Tyler, you should know that Judge Morrison comes from an extremely wealthy family. Morrison Enterprises is one of the largest private equity firms in California, with holdings in technology, real estate, and entertainment companies throughout the western United States." Tyler's face went pale as the full implications of Mark's statement became clear. "Emma, are you telling me that you're marrying into serious money? Like serious money?" "James's family has been financially successful," I said diplomatically. "But that's not why I'm marrying him. I'm marrying him because he's intelligent, principled, and shares my values about justice and public service." Jessica had remained silent during this exchange, but now she grabbed my arm with an intensity that surprised me. "Emma, why didn't you tell us? We're your family. This is huge news that you kept secret from everyone who loves you." The hurt in her voice was genuine, and I realized that my decision to keep the relationship private had created unintended consequences for family relationships that were still recovering from years of misunderstanding and emotional distance. "I wanted to be sure the relationship was solid before making any announcements," I explained. "James's position requires discretion about personal relationships, and I preferred to keep things private until we were ready to make formal commitments." Tyler was still processing the economic implications of my engagement. "Emma, when you say his family has money, are we talking about millions of dollars? Tens of millions? Mark answered before I could respond. More like hundreds of millions. Morrison Enterprises is estimated to be worth over $1 billion, and James is the primary heir. Emma, you're going to be married to one of the wealthiest men in America. The number seemed to hit Tyler like a physical blow. This was the same man who had questioned whether I could handle his tax fraud case just 2 years earlier. The same person who had assumed I was just some local lawyer without significant professional credentials or connections. Now he was learning that I was engaged to someone whose family wealth exceeded anything he had ever imagined possible. $300 million, Tyler said weakly. Emma, that's more money than most people can even conceptualize. You're going to be living like royalty. We're going to be living like two people who work in public service and happen to have family resources available if needed, I corrected. James takes his judicial responsibilities very seriously, and I intend to continue practicing criminal defense law. The money is nice, but it's not the focus of our relationship. Jessica was staring at me with an expression that combined amazement, pride, and something that might have been envy. Emma, you're going to be married to a federal judge who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you understand how incredible that is? You've achieved something that most people only dream about. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. For 30 years, my family had worried that I was too serious, too focused on impractical goals, too disconnected from the social skills that led to conventional success. Now they were celebrating my engagement to someone who represented the pinnacle of both professional achievement and financial success. I've achieved something that makes me happy, I said simply. James and I are compatible intellectually and emotionally. The rest is just circumstances. Tyler shook his head in apparent disbelief. Emma, this isn't just circumstances. This is like winning the lottery while simultaneously being appointed to the Supreme Court. You've reached levels of success that most people can't even imagine. Mark, who had been observing this family drama with obvious interest, offered a perspective that cut through some of the shock and amazement. Tyler, what's most impressive isn't the money or the prestige. It's that Emma has built the kind of career and reputation that puts her in social and professional circles where she can meet people like James on equal terms. She didn't marry up. She married a peer. The observation was perceptive and accurate. My relationship with James wasn't based on his rescuing me from limited circumstances or my providing him with something he couldn't find elsewhere. We were both accomplished professionals who had found in each other the intellectual compatibility and emotional connection that successful partnerships require. But Tyler and Jessica were still struggling to process the magnitude of what they had learned. Emma, Jessica said, you're going to be living in mansions and flying in private jets and attending galas with senators and movie stars. Your life is going to be like something out of a fairy tale. My life is going to involve continuing the work I love while sharing it with someone who understands and supports my professional goals, I replied. Everything else is just details. Tyler was shaking his head in what appeared to be a combination of amazement and regret. Emma, I can't believe I ever questioned your abilities or your judgment. I was worried about whether you could handle my little tax case, and you're engaged to someone who could probably buy and sell my entire industry without noticing the expense. The comment crystallized something that had been building throughout the evening's revelations. Tyler's amazement wasn't really about James's wealth or judicial position. It was about the recognition that I had built something extraordinary, while he and the rest of my family had remained oblivious to my achievements and potential. Tyler, I said gently, the skills that resolved your case successfully are the same skills that allowed me to build the kind of career where I could meet someone like James. You didn't misjudge my abilities. You just didn't understand what I was building during all those years when everyone thought I was being impractical. Mark was nodding in agreement with my assessment. Emma's right. Federal judges don't socialize with mediocre attorneys. The Fact that she's in James's professional and social circle tells you everything you need to know about her reputation in the legal community. Jessica had been silent during this exchange, but now she looked at me with an expression that combined admiration and something that might have been sadness. "Emma, I feel like I've been living next to a celebrity without realizing it. You've achieved things that are so far beyond what I imagined possible, and I never saw it happening." "You saw what you expected to see," I said without accusation. I was the serious little sister who spent too much time studying. It was natural to assume that pattern would continue indefinitely. Tyler was still processing the implications of everything he had learned. "Emma, when you were representing me, you were doing it as a favor to family. But you could have been charging fees that most people couldn't afford. You could have been working exclusively for clients who pay millions of dollars for legal representation." "I chose to help family when family needed help," I said simply. "That's what people do when they have skills that can solve problems for people they care about." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my parents, who had noticed the intense discussion at our table and had come over to investigate what was causing such animated conversation. Dad approached with the slightly forced joviality that people use when they sense they've missed something important. "What's all the excitement over here?" he asked, looking around the group with curiosity. "You all look like someone just announced that they'd won the lottery or discovered buried treasure." Tyler and Jessica exchanged glances, silently debating who should reveal the information that had transformed their understanding of who I was and what I had achieved. Finally, Jessica took a deep breath and looked directly at our parents. "Mom, Dad," she said, "Emma has some news that she's been keeping private. She's engaged to be married." Mom's face immediately brightened with maternal excitement. "Emma, that's wonderful. When did this happen? Who is he? Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "His name is James Morrison," I said calmly. "He's a federal judge based in California. We met at a legal conference 8 months ago and got engaged 6 weeks ago. I wanted to be sure the relationship was solid before making any announcements." Dad's expression shifted from excitement to something approaching awe as he processed the implications of what I had revealed. "A federal judge? Emma, federal judges are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They're among the most powerful people in the American legal system. James is a good man who takes his responsibilities seriously," I replied. "We share similar perspectives on legal issues and criminal justice reform." Mark, who had been watching this family revelation with obvious fascination, decided to provide the information that would complete the picture. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, you should know that Judge Morrison comes from the Morrison family that owns Morrison Enterprises, one of the largest private equity firms on the West Coast. He's personally worth several $100 million. The silence that followed Mark's statement was profound and complete. Mom and Dad stared at me with expressions that combined shock, amazement, and something that might have been disbelief. They seemed unable to process that their daughter, the one they had worried was too impractical and too serious, was engaged to someone whose wealth and power exceeded their most extravagant fantasies. "Several $100 million? Dad whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the information disappear. "James's family has been financially successful," I confirmed. "But that's not the foundation of our relationship. We're compatible intellectually and emotionally, and we share similar values about public service and social justice." Mom was shaking her head in apparent disbelief. "Emma, you're going to be married to someone worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you understand what that means? You're going to be one of the wealthiest women in America." "I'm going to be married to someone I love who happens to come from a wealthy family," I corrected. "The money is nice, but it's not why I'm marrying him." Tyler, who had recovered somewhat from his initial shock, offered an observation that captured the magnitude of what everyone had learned. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma isn't just marrying, well, She's achieved the kind of professional success that puts her in social circles where she can meet people like Judge Morrison on equal terms. This isn't about her being rescued by wealth. It's about her earning access to levels of success that most people never even glimpse. Dad was nodding slowly, as if finally understanding something that had eluded him for years. Emma, I owe you an apology. We spent so many years worrying that you were too serious, too focused on impractical goals. We never imagined that you were building something this extraordinary. You couldn't have imagined it, I said gently. I couldn't have imagined it either when I was in law school. Success happens gradually, through decisions and opportunities that build on each other, over time. Mom was looking at me with an expression that combined pride and something that might have been regret. Emma, we've been so proud of Jessica's achievements that we never fully appreciated what you were accomplishing. We can see now that we underestimated you in ways that were probably hurtful. The acknowledgement was more than I had ever expected to receive from my parents, representing validation that I had stopped seeking years earlier, but that still meant something when it finally arrived. You loved me the best way you knew how, I said. That's what matters. Jessica had remained silent during this exchange between me and our parents, but now she looked at me with an expression that combined admiration and genuine affection. Emma, I'm so proud of you. You've achieved something incredible while staying true to yourself and your values. You deserve every bit of happiness and success that's coming your way. The wedding reception continued around us, but our table had become an island of intense family conversation that seemed separate from the larger celebration. Guests at nearby tables were beginning to notice our animated discussion and the emotional intensity of our exchanges, though they couldn't hear the specific revelations that were transforming our family's understanding of itself. Mark, who had inadvertently catalyzed this entire evening of revelations, offered a final observation that perfectly captured the significance of what had been revealed. Tyler, Jessica, Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, you should understand that what Emma has achieved goes beyond personal success. She's built the kind of career and reputation that represents the best of what's possible in American professional life. She's someone who has earned respect through competence, integrity, and dedication to justice. The wealth and prestige are just bonuses that come with that level of achievement. As the evening continued and our family gradually returned to participating in Jessica's wedding celebration, I reflected on how dramatically one conversation had changed everyone's understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. The little sister who had been overlooked and underestimated for 30 years had been revealed as someone whose success exceeded their most ambitious dreams. But perhaps more importantly, the revelation had finally closed the gap between my family's perception of my achievements and the reality of what I had built during those years when they thought I was being impractical and overly serious. They could finally see that the traits they had worried about were actually the foundation of success that had taken me places they had never imagined possible. The validation was satisfying in ways that surprised me, representing the completion of a journey that had begun with that dinner at Olive Garden, when they had questioned whether law school was appropriate for someone like me. Now they understood not just that I had succeeded, but that I had succeeded spectacularly, in ways that had transformed not just my life, but potentially theirs as well. Jessica's wedding had become the setting for my family's discovery that the daughter they had underestimated was actually the most successful person any of them had ever known personally. It was a fitting conclusion to a story that had begun with invisibility and had culminated in recognition that exceeded even my own expectations. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave the reception, Tyler approached me one final time with an expression of genuine humility and gratitude. "Emma," he said, "I want you to know that representing me changed my life in ways that go beyond keeping me out of prison. Watching you work, seeing your professionalism and competence, taught me what real success looks like. You're an inspiration to everyone who knows you." The compliment was generous and heartfelt, representing a complete transformation in how Tyler viewed both my abilities and my achievements. But it also highlighted how dramatically this evening had changed all of our relationships and our family's understanding of itself. I had finally received the recognition and validation I had unconsciously sought for decades, and it had come at exactly the moment when I no longer needed it for my sense of self-worth or professional identity. The transformation was complete, and our family would never be the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.